Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the story of the Garden of Clockless Hours. But before you settle in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of content. I'd love to know where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you, so drop that in the comments. It's always amazing seeing people from all over the world tuning in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that cozy background hum, and let's drift into tonight's story together. You arrive just as the sky begins to blur between gray and honey. That strange half-light hour when even the birds sound unsure of themselves, offering up sleepy chirps like they're testing the acoustics. You're standing on a cobbled path older than most maps, and definitely older than your favorite hoodie. The stones are worn, weather-smooth, each one a pebble in a long-forgotten river of footsteps. A breeze floats by, soft as folded linen, carrying the scent of crushed lavender, old bark, and something like distant bread. Behind you, nothing. In front of you, an arched gate carved from ash wood, barely holding itself together. Ivy clings to it like an elderly cat, refusing to let go of its sun-warmed chair. Welcome to the Garden of Clockless Hours. Like it's been waiting for someone to notice it all day. Don't worry about the time here. There are no clocks, no chimes, no rude little notifications. It was maintained not by monks, but by a quiet and consistently sunburned order of lay gardeners, known as the Temporari, or loosely translated, the ones with nothing urgent to do. Plants were watered not on schedule, but when they seemed a little sad, paths were laid where feet naturally wandered. It was less about control and more about observation. Just the long, sighing rhythm of things that grow when no one is watching. Just a suggestion. You probably won't make it through this day. You didn't even know roses could sag, but here, they do it with style. Every midsummer, they'd gathered to celebrate all the things they hadn't gotten around to half-rake the leaves. Unplanted bulbs, broken ladders still waiting for repair. They'd drink lukewarm cider and read aloud from lists of what they meant to do that year. It was oddly liberating. The shadows stretch, but not menacingly more, like cats curling into longer naps. But another document, written in faded walnut ink, claims a single sundial remained hidden behind a curtain of vines, only for emergencies. It has no reputation to maintain. It just is. Nothing spectacular happens, but somehow that's enough. In the center, a sundial lies on its side, half covered in lichen. So, maybe that secret sundial wasn't such a secret after all. Historians still debate whether this emergency sundial ever existed, or if it was just an elaborate excuse for when someone accidentally scheduled a prayer too early. But that's not a bad thing. In fact, that's sort of the point. If you're new here, feel free to gently tap the like button. It's somewhere near your fingers. And if the spirit of history moves you, go ahead and subscribe. No rush. It's not like time's going anywhere. A small wooden sign, faded and slightly passive-aggressive, reads, "Quiet, please. The plants are meditating." You half expect the next sign to say, "No existential crisis after sundown." Somewhere nearby, a wheelbarrow creaks, even though you see no one. Comment your current location and local time so we know what you're falling asleep next to. A heater, a sleeping cat, a husband who's snoring like a vintage lawnmower. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You step through the arch and find yourself not quite in a garden, but not quite in a place at all. It's as if the idea of a garden fell asleep mid-sentence and never woke up. Grass grows in casual tufts, making no effort to be a lawn. Moss forms curious little islands on stones. A pear tree leans at a reckless angle, like it's trying to hear gossip from the sunflower patch. The air is warm, but in a tired kind of way. You follow a winding gravel trail, bordered by hedges trimmed into uneven humps. This place, the Garden of Clockless Hours, was once tucked inside the estate of a 14th century monastery, outside the town of Vézelay, France. They believed time was an illusion, or, at the very least, a bad habit. So they cultivated a garden meant to mirror life without deadlines. You pass a fountain with no water, just a stone bowl filled with feathers and leaves, perhaps a nest for the wind. A blackbird hops out of the underbrush and regards you like an exhausted librarian. Then it vanishes into the thick, sagging roses. One historical record suggests the temporary once banned all timepieces on the premises, even sundials. You pause near a crumbling bench. It's the kind of bench that sighs when you sit on it. You let it sigh. The obscurity of the place is staggering. Did you know the monks here once hosted a festival of unfinished chores? A dragonfly hums past your ear, sounding more like a power tool than an insect. Time here dilates. Your footsteps become dreamlike, the crunch of gravel soft and unhurried. You find yourself at a circular clearing, hedged in by tall wild grasses, swaying like they've just remembered how to dance. And maybe that's the point. The garden doesn't mind contradictions. You close your eyes for a moment, just to listen. You wake, or maybe you never slept. It's hard to tell here. The sun hasn't moved, though the light has shifted. Now it's tinged with amber, like it's been steeped in chamomile. You're not exactly lost, but you're no longer sure how you got to this part of the garden. That's fine. The gravel path gives up and turns into dirt, then to soft moss, then just nothing at all. You are now walking where the ground wants you to walk. Congratulations. In the Garden of Clockless Hours, everyone gets gently misplaced now and then. To your left, an orchard is spilled out into the walking path, not aggressively, just casually. Apples the color of old lace hang from short, gnarled trees. What was once neglect is now considered accidental genius. You see, sometimes procrastination saves lives. Nobody's even told it. There's no water. It just likes the attention. One drops with a quiet thunk, startling a rabbit into a dignified retreat. You descend, slowly, the temperature dropping by degrees. The smell changes to earthy, like mushroom bread and damp parchment. A pair of bees pass each other mid-air without acknowledging one another, like co-workers on break, who never drank from it but used it as an offering to the garden's unseen curators, a vague and probably imaginary workforce of garden spirits. Eloan insisted they were responsible for the healthy thyme and suspiciously symmetrical pumpkins. One journal mentions he once blamed a garden gnome's smile for his missing sandals. Above, clouds drift in the shape of shrugging sheep. Baskets overflow not with onions, but dried petals, feathers, and what looks like a half-finished sock. The whole place is lit by one small skylight through which a vine has confidently inserted itself. From here, the sounds of the garden stack gently on top of one another. Rustling leaves, a distant dove, the crunch of an unseen snail making its way through dry mulch. The air is thick with silence and soil. The kind of silence that doesn't demand anything from you. The kind that says, we're all just compost in the end. It's framed with moss and rusted hinges. You reach for the handle, which is satisfyingly squeaky, and pull it open. Possibly the world's quietest parade. You stroll deeper, brushing past a hedge that smells of mint and something faintly like vanilla. The temporary, once-believed paths were not meant to be designed, but discovered. They had a saying scratched faintly into a gatepost somewhere. The foot knows more than the eye. A nice thought. Unless you're wearing sandals and walking through thistles. You pass a low stone wall, partially collapsed, decorated with tiny terracotta faces, some smiling, some grimacing, and at least one that looks suspiciously like your high school algebra teacher. Beyond it, a willow tree weeps dramatically into a dry creek bed. He wrote that time here is not a line, but a pond still, deep, and full of frogs. It's unclear whether Milo was being poetic or had simply stepped on a frog. You settle on a flat rock beside the willow, feeling its drooping branches stir in the breeze like forgotten thoughts. Back in the 1400s, a visiting Hungarian scribe named Milo recorded his stay in the garden. One major fact that slips through the moss of time: the temporary helped preserve several rare strains of medicinal herbs during the Black Death, not through careful record-keeping, but by forgetting to harvest them. Scholars still debate whether the herbal preservation was deliberate or just the result of chronic monastic napping. You look up. Just beyond the willow, you spot something odd, a small door in the ground, like a root cellar or the beginning of a very lazy bunker. It leads quite anticlimactically to a set of shallow stone steps. You find yourself in a root cellar that has clearly given up on its original purpose. Shelves hold not turnips, but scrolls. In the back corner, a table holds a single ceramic mug. It's full of acorns. According to local myth, the mug belonged to a gardener named Eloan. You sit for a while on an upturned basket. Eventually, you climb back up, blinking as light returns. A breeze finds you again, as if to say, "Still here? Good. You are. For now." Back above ground, the light has softened into that familiar golden syrup hue, the one photographers chase, but never quite catch. You blink, stretch, and feel as if you've woken from a dream, nested inside a longer, slower dream. Everything is quieter now. Even the insects buzz in lowercase. You follow a trail you're fairly sure didn't exist before. It snakes between two hedges that seem to lean in close, as if whispering secrets about you. Don't worry, they're mostly complimentary. The path opens into a meadow littered with wildflowers, the kind that look painted by someone who fell asleep halfway through. Here a daisy with three heads. There a tulip slumped sideways like it's had a long day. The cover reads, "On the Acceptable Inexactness of Things," by an author with a name too long to bother remembering. The book smells of dust and time. You open to a random page. The text reads, "A vine has coiled itself around the banister in an act of slow rebellion. A cricket begins an offbeat symphony." One cricket. Still, where participants would attempt to go the longest without speaking, the winner received a robe. Everything leans, slouches, stretches toward the sun, as if the sun were a mildly interesting story, and they were trying their best to stay awake. In the center of the meadow stands a gazebo or the ghost of one. Half the roof is gone. The pillars lean like they're gossiping, staring at a nearby stone engraved with curling script. It simply says, "Nap if you must." Inside the gazebo sits a wooden chair, and on it, an abandoned book. You pick it up gently, but it doesn't have to. To be precise is to be punctual. To be inexact is to be kind to the moment. They didn't catalog books alphabetically, or by author, or even by topic. Instead, books were shelved by mood. Cloudy afternoon reading. The sky above is a pale lavender canvas, smeared with streaks of cream. A single crow crosses overhead, slow and steady, like it's considering early retirement. You nap, the meadow hums with dusk. The system was never adopted elsewhere, possibly because no one else had the patience. You close the book. You'll remember that line, or you won't. Either way, the moment is content. In the late 15th century, the temporary became known for their strange library habits. You lie back on the grass beside the gazebo. A bee investigates her elbow, and finding it unremarkable, moves on. Somewhere in the grass near your foot, a nearby plaque half sunk in the ground and tilted like its lost interest reads. One particularly obscure tidbit about the garden. Every 17 years, and the garden waits. The twilight here doesn't announce itself. It glides in like a well-trained butler, setting everything dimmer without making a sound. The trees darken, the hedges hush, and even your own thoughts seem to switch to a softer frequency. Like a theater prop waiting for its scene. A single lily pad floats at its center, occupied by a frog who looks like he's waiting for someone very late to tea. Everywhere. Maintained, once upon a time, by a monk named Eberd, who believed each stone contained a memory. He never labeled them, sighed it would interfere with their emotional privacy. The temporary left this area mostly untouched, believing moonlight did better work than hands ever could. Visitors were encouraged to sit quietly and let the stones tell them what they wanted to be called. Allegedly, one stone told a visitor its name was Trevor. The greenhouse is crammed with pots and jars and hanging bundles of things dried and crinkled and vaguely threatening. The smell hits you instantly. They said, a single scent can take you further than any hour hand. Not one smell, but dozens layered like blankets. Cinnamon, salt, mint, mud, something citrusy, something like soap your grandmother used. They used marjoram, rue, lavender, and even old apple peel steeped in vinegar to calm the mind and body. In this greenhouse, it was common for monks to sit in silence for hours, smelling, just smelling, until a memory surfaced that helped them fall asleep, but not filled with books or tools or tea. Each shelf holds a different rock. Smooth ones. You inhale. You remember something small, a picnic maybe, or a coat that smelled like cinnamon, or nothing at all. Jagged ones. Ones that look like bread crust. One that looks exactly like the face of a Roman emperor. You're not sure which one, but definitely someone who demanded grapes in bulk. You wave. He does not wave back. You walk again, though it's hard to tell what direction you're heading. But, as you may have guessed by now, direction is not a priority here. You pass a pond that looks suspiciously like a mirror laid flat. Its surface is so still it almost seems fake. Next to the pond, a small wooden hut leans drunkenly against a tree. You approach. Somewhere nearby, a tree creaks like a yawning door. You follow a new path lit by tiny lanterns hung low on crooked poles. The lanterns flicker with no flame, no visible source of light, possibly optimism. There is no door, just an opening with a bead curtain that clinks gently in the wind like polite applause. Inside, shelves. This is the stone house. You sit on a small stool, the kind that gives you splinters if you shift too confidently. You wait. A minute passes. Then another. Then possibly an hour. Or 3 seconds. A stone near your foot looks vaguely like your childhood pet. You decide not to unpack that right now. The air inside the stone house is thick with potential meaning. Or maybe it's just humidity. You step back out. The moon has shown up fashionably early. It leans against the sky like it owns the place. This part of the garden was reserved for night walkers, people who preferred the quiet thrum of after-sunset hours, where plants looked less like specimens and more like shapes in a dream. In the far corner of the lantern path, you come across a curious sign. This way to the greenhouse of forgotten smells. Well, how could you not? You enter. It's warmer inside. Thick, humid air clings to your skin like an old memory. Here's the secret. The temporary believed that smells were the truest clocks of all. One major historical fact. Aromatic therapy was part of early medieval monastic healing, long before essential oils were hawked in your aunt's group chat. Scholars still argue whether the greenhouse was truly therapeutic, or just a convenient way to avoid chores without being reprimanded. You find a wooden bench beneath a hanging fern. The fern seems slightly disappointed in you, but that's just its vibe. You sit anyway, and for a moment, the world stops pretending to be busy. You stay there for a while. The lanterns flicker on. The greenhouse sighs. Outside, the moon waits. And so does the rest of the garden. You step back out into the night, and for the first time, notice just how quiet the silence is here. Not empty, no. That would be boring, but full of soft rustles and occasional nocturnal throat clearing from invisible creatures. A kind of silence that feels politely curated. Dozens of them, moving like sleepy punctuation in the air. Not so much illuminating as gently suggesting. You follow their bobbing dance through a narrow passage hemmed in by lavender bushes, all heavy with bloom, sagging under the weight of their own perfume. The path beneath your feet is lit now by fireflies. This part of the garden has no name. Or maybe it does, but the sign fell over a century ago, and no one could be bothered to put it back up. You begin to suspect the whole place is a bit allergic to signage. You squint. It's a breadcrumb, possibly rye. One obscure record claims the monks once planted a series of dream herbs that they believed could influence sleep when smelled at certain times of night. Among them, mugwort, valerian, and something called fox's rest, now lost to modern taxonomy. Some say it was a rare hybrid of mint and nightshade. Others believe it never existed at all. Scholars still debate whether fox's rest was a plant, a sleeping draught, or just a nickname for a favorite hammock. The ants move with the kind of intensity usually reserved for flash mobs or committee meetings. You step aside, let them have their moment. And beside it, something you hadn't expected, a teacup, perfectly intact, balanced on a fence post. Inside it, a single dried daisy. Around the year 1508, a group of elderly gardeners began meeting weekly to discuss plants, patience, and whether slugs have souls. They took notes on wax tablets, then promptly melted them in the sun the next day. The air thickens not unpleasantly, just more deliberate, like it's asking you to notice it. You do. You notice everything now. The scent of thyme under your shoe, the call of a bat overhead, the slow, sleepy groan of wood adjusting itself in the night. Not out of carelessness. They simply believed ideas should be composted like everything else. Here, you pass a small sitting eyrie, a circle of mismatched chairs around a hollowed-out tree stump. One of the chairs has a pillow embroidered with the phrase, "Half of gardening is just waiting." You briefly wonder who embroidered it. Then you remember where you are. Probably no one in particular. Dill, sage, tarragon, fennel all flattened slightly, as though someone gently tucked them in. There's a distant owl, offering its opinion in the form of a muffled hoo. It's unclear whether it's agreeing with you or simply venting. Historically speaking, this corner was rumored to be the site of the garden's unofficial philosophy club. You lean against a low stone wall and gaze out at a field of sleeping herbs. At your feet, a line of ants carries something glistening. The obscurity for this section? You wander past a broken sundial lying face down in the dirt, as if it just gave up. You have no explanation for it, nor does anyone else. You continue on, now deeper into the garden than you've ever been. And somewhere behind it all, the very distant sound of soft laughter. Maybe the garden is dreaming too. You're walking now on crushed oyster shells. Don't ask why they crunch just enough to keep you slightly aware of your own existence. The shells shimmer in the moonlight, throwing off faint glints like forgotten thoughts. Ahead, you see an archway carved into a hedge. Above it, a wooden sign hangs crookily from one nail. It reads, "The Gallery of Perpetual Repairs." You duck through the arch. It was designed to mark not hours, but moods. The mechanism failed almost immediately when a frog took up residence inside the funnel. No one had the heart to evict him. Inside, the garden narrows into what looks like a corridor of half-finished projects. A pergola missing its roof slouches toward a leaning trellis. A brick path stops abruptly after 5 feet. There's a half-painted birdhouse hanging from a tree branch, the brush still stuck in a can of hardened paint below it. Welcome to one of the strangest chapters of the Temporary's legacy. In it, they display failed projects, broken tools, and burned bread with proud commentary. The motto was, "Shame fades, compost endures." Some of the exhibits were wildly popular. One scroll describes Brother Reynard's exploding beach jam with both admiration and lingering trauma. By the early 16th century, the monks began to celebrate the art of never finishing anything. They believed incompletion was sacred, a sign that something was still alive, still growing, still becoming. Through it, you see the garden continue same grass, same stars, same hush. But it feels different, framed, smaller, stranger. The wind sifts through the branches like a sleepy librarian closing up for the night. It flutters off after a moment, possibly bored by your lack of floral notes. You keep walking. A single tree stands at its center, ancient, bent, covered in blooms that glow faintly, like they're photosynthesizing moonlight. You step around it, and everything feels normal again, or whatever passes for normal, in a place that measures time in plant size and accidental poetry. So they kept a part of the garden intentionally half-built, constantly repaired, always just a little undone. One monk called it the eternal to-do list. Inside it, sprigs of rosemary, defiantly green. A rusty trowel sticks out like a forgotten bookmark. Another referred to it more poetically as a place where ambition naps. One major historical fact, among the strange architectural experiments, left half complete, was an outdoor sundial powered by dripping water. You pause beside a broken wheelbarrow, now used as a planter. Nearby, a sign is nailed to a stake in the ground. Do not fix. Everything here is fixing itself in its own time. You smile, then you trip over a rake. Even poetry has its limits. As you hobble slightly forward, you pass what might once have been a workbench, now hosting a tea set growing mold in 3 shades of green. One teacup has sprouted something. Possibly moss, possibly ambition. The cultural oddity of this section? The monks of this region used to hold a seasonal event called the unveiling of mistakes. Historians still debate whether this celebration was a form of humility training or just a very elaborate group therapy session. You pass a cracked window frame leaning against a stump. A moth lands on your sleeve. You admire its pattern browns and creams, like old parchment folded in the dark. Eventually, the corridor opens into a clearing bathed in silver light. You don't know its name. No one does. And that feels appropriate. You sit at its base, back against bark, heartbeat quiet. Above you, a few clouds shuffle around, undecided. And somewhere out there, just barely audible, the faint chime of a wind bell no longer hung from anything. You stay beneath the moonlit tree longer than you meant to, if meant to even applies anymore. Time here stretches like warm dough, soft and elastic, rising quietly in the background of your awareness. When you do rise, it's not because you feel ready. Somewhere in the underbrush, something rustles that doesn't reveal itself. Probably a hedgehog. Possibly a monk reincarnated as a hedgehog. The garden has opinions about reincarnation, but rarely says them out loud. It's simply because the tree seems to exhale, as if politely releasing you. The steps dip down into the earth, cool and promising. You descend, brushing aside a few cobwebs that look hand-woven. You walk again. There's a stone altar, but it's covered in pots of rosemary and wild strawberries. The flame flickers politely. Around you, the shadows take on the texture of old linen, familiar and undemanding. It reads, "All things must rest, even you." You sit on a bench that doesn't creak too loudly. You breathe in the scent of damp roots and dried herbs. You close your eyes, not to sleep, just to pause. There are pews, but they're mismatched wooden benches, some with shovels leaned against them. The temporary believed that planting a bulb was a kind of prayer, that weeding was a meditation, and that composting your failures, both agricultural and emotional, was necessary for new growth. A rake lies like a sleeping guard dog in the corner. You emerge into starlight, so thick it almost hums. This time, the path feels different, less like a trail and more like a suggestion. Moss pads your steps. Low ferns wave you along. Ahead, a stone stairway reveals itself, half buried in ivy. At the bottom, you enter what seems to be a subterranean chapel, if chapels were designed by gardeners who got distracted halfway through. The scent, they claimed, helped sweeten the past. You find a small pile of these leaves in a shallow bowl, crinkled with time. One has faint writing still visible. "I once hoarded pears. I'm sorry. This is the sanctuary of soft labors." It was used, centuries ago, for rituals that blended spiritual devotion with the practical act of tending soil. One documented ritual involved silently burying regrets written on dried basil leaves. A curious fact, the monks here brewed a ceremonial tea only drunk before sunset on the equinox. It was made from 9 ingredients, none of which anyone ever wrote down. Modern researchers have attempted to recreate it mostly with tragic digestive results. Historians still debate whether the recipe was kept secret or simply forgotten after a long nap. You light a small oil lamp sitting on the altar. You notice a carved message on the stone wall behind the altar. So you do. The silence here is padded. Not empty, but considerate. It waits with you. Then, When it feels right, you stand and walk back up the steps. The air smells of time and memory, and the path ahead seems to nod in approval. You take the path to the right, the one flanked by low stone lanterns with no candles in them. They glow anyway, in a color you'd describe as moon-soaked milk if pressed. You've stumbled upon what remains of the punctual garden, a failed experiment, tucked reluctantly into one corner of the Garden of Clockless Hours. The trail curves in lazy loops like someone doodling on the earth. He installed sundials, lined paths in perfect geometric grids, and rang a bell every hour to mark designated watering times. The plants, as the story goes, hated it. The rosemary withered. The carrots twisted themselves into little fists. Even the daisies stopped smiling. Soon you reach a clearing unlike the others. This one feels planned, a bit too symmetrical, a bit too well swept. A cracked metronome sits atop a broken pedestal. A sign lies face down in the grass. You flip it over. It says, "Efficiency is not a virtue. It's a phase." Even the garden seems to be rolling its eyes at its own past. Centuries ago, one over-enthusiastic novice decided to bring order here. The ground is soft and fragrant, made entirely of fallen needles and dreams deferred. It didn't need one. It was simply where the monks went to be tall thoughts in small bodies. No benches, no signs, just space. Eventually, the experiment was abandoned. Nature reclaimed most of it, but a few remnants remain. Not advice, not secrets. Just something useful. One monk claimed to have heard the phrase, "Keep your knees warm." Another swore he heard, "Trust whatever grows sideways." It didn't work. The tulips refused, blooming randomly, wilting defiantly, and in one case, growing upside down. It reads, "Turn left for dreams. Turn right for more garden." You turn left. Stars blink gently through the needles, like shy children waving behind curtains. The branches sway above in slow rhythms, brushing starlight back and forth. The experiment was quietly written off as a lesson in humility. You sit beside a fountain that no longer burbles. A permission, maybe, or a very quiet yes. Inside, lily pads float aimlessly, their roots dancing in forgotten rhythm. You wander until the trees part again, and the sky opens wide. One pad has a single boot print on it. You try not to think about it too much. One actual historical fact. During the brief punctual phase, the monks attempted to breed a species of predictable tulip that bloomed on schedule. Scholars still debate whether the entire punctual project was satire, or if one monk just had a bit of a calendar obsession. It lets out a noise, like an old man remembering something embarrassing. A few bats flap by overhead in response. As you wander further, you notice little signs of rebellion. Vines strangling an old hourglass, moss growing in precise tick marks along a fallen log. You find a rusted bell on a post, and out of curiosity, give it a small ring. You walk on. Beyond the clearing, you enter a grove of trees, so tall they seem to lean inward, forming a vaulted ceiling of branches. This part of the garden was never named. You lie down in the center, watching the sky through the filtered canopy. A cultural tidbit. It was once believed that if you lay here long enough, the trees would whisper something meaningful to you. You hear nothing, but you feel something. You drift a little, then rise, then drift again. Somewhere nearby, an owl mutters something disapproving. You agree, even though you didn't hear it properly. And just ahead, another sign, barely legible, tilted like it's been through a long day. Of course you do. The path not flowers this time. The path opens to a clearing that doesn't feel outdoors anymore. A pavilion stands in the center, made of pale stone and draped with heavy linen curtains that flutter in windless air. It's not grand. It's not dramatic. It's waiting. The flame doesn't flicker. The wax never drips. You begin to wonder if the moth knows something you don't. Not dramatically. Just slightly like a sheet being gently pulled over you. Your shoulders relax. Your jaw unclenches. Your thoughts slow down to the pace of moss. One recorded dream involved a goose lecturing about rainfall. Another described a spoon filled with the sound of bells. No one ever reached a conclusion. That was the whole point. You step inside. Not erase your worries, just let them breathe. Let them wander off for a bit. You feel that now. The quiet here has layers. It's not just silence. It's permission. But something stranger. Warm milk. Charcoal. The worn scent of book pages. Specifically the sharbig, or four-part garden. But instead of dividing space, the monks here tried to divide time, creating a symbolic quadrant for morning rest, afternoon drifting, twilight thought, and midnight dreams. It never quite worked, but they loved the idea of it anyway. You pass a tree with bark that peels in perfect curls, like paper invitations to a nap. Another tree hums gently, though that might just be wind, or your thoughts, or something in between. To the left begins as barely a trail at all, just the suggestion of footsteps in soft earth, faint depressions where others may or may not have wandered. You follow anyway, because that's how dreams usually start. Not with clarity, but with a feeling that maybe, just maybe, you're meant to be here. The air thickens with fragrance. Ahead, this is the pavilion of nested hours. In the old days, monks would come here when sleep eluded them, or when dreams felt heavy and unclear. They believed this place held folded time layers of rest, stitched into the fabric of the night. Or if one monk simply had a thing for symmetry and naps. Beneath the pavilion, protected by glass domes, you lean closer. One of them reads, "To dream is to travel while remaining." Another, curiously, "Time sleeps longer when no one watches." A shallow pool reflects the sky above, even when it's overcast. Tonight, the stars look clearer in the water than overhead. You sit at the pool's edge and dip your fingers in. The water is warm. No ripples follow. One historical detail of note. This pavilion was inspired by Persian garden architecture. Scholars still debate whether the design was based on Persian influence. A low bench near the water holds a series of handwritten scrolls. A moth flutters through the pavilion, drawn toward a single candle burning on the far wall. As you sit there, you feel something shift. The monks believed that this pavilion could unstitch the tight seams of thinking. A cultural oddity. For a brief period in the early 1500s, the pavilion hosted midnight, half-dream councils, where monks would gather half awake to share fragments of dreams and interpret them collectively. You lie back on a cushion near the pool. The candlelight softens your edges. The stars ripple in the water without moving. And somewhere between breath and stillness, between the moon and the bench under your back, the hours begin to fold again. You're not asleep, but you're not quite here anymore either. You stay quietly, in the middle of everything that's unhurried. When you finally rise, if you ever truly sat down at all, the world outside the pavilion has cooled into a silver hush. You step back onto the path, the ground now so soft it barely remembers your footsteps. Up ahead, fireflies return, but slower now, their light dimmer. Not sleepy, just considerate. Chairs surround it, some upright, some tilting precariously like guests who've overstayed their welcome. On the table, wooden plates, ceramic bowls, dried herbs bundled like invitations, and a single candle that refuses to go out. You pass under an archway made of twined willow branches, then into a wide, low field covered in what looks like fog, though it smells more like steeped oats. The grass is short here, recently grazed. Not by animals, at least. None you can see, but perhaps by time itself, nibbling quietly at the edges of things. Meals were incidental. Words mattered less than the silences between them. In the center of the field is a long wooden table, partially sunken into the earth. The topic? Whether or not stones can be considered polite. The final answer was inconclusive, but deeply respectful. This is the table of long conversations. It's not meant for dining. Not really. It's where people came to speak slowly, or not at all. One major historical fact. This table hosted one of the longest recorded conversations in monastic history, 9 hours of spoken word, and 47 minutes of shared staring. Beyond the far end of the table lies a narrow gate, barely visible through the soft fog. You're not sure what's on the other side. A hedge, another section of garden. The past. You reach in and find a small note. It reads, "Eat only if restless, leave only if ready. No sharp angles. No abrupt decisions." A cultural curiosity. During certain seasons, the monks would leave empty seats at the table for visitors from the next world, or possibly the last dream. Occasionally, a chair would be found warm the next morning, the candle slightly lower. Nothing else ever moved. You catch it before it flies off. Scribbled in sleepy handwriting. Speak less, listen more, and speak even less. Scholars still debate whether these chairs were meant for spirits, dreamers, or just symbolic guests who never RSVP'd. You sit at one end, beside a chipped bowl filled with dried figs and acorns. You eat nothing, but you stay. The wind drifts across the table in slow waves, riffling through a loose page of parchment. A bat swoops low over the table, as if checking in. It vanishes before you can thank it. You stare across the field. You rise slowly, your body now moving in the rhythm of this place. You walk toward the gate, not because you're finished here, but because the garden is ready to show you something new. The gate ahead is barely a gate at all, just 2 ancient posts leaning toward each other, like old friends sharing a joke neither of them quite remembers. A wisp of ivy stretches between them like a ribbon across a race you never meant to enter. You pass through slowly. Their limbs are twisted, their leaves broad and rustling like restless papers. Here, the moonlight filters through in patches, like a lantern with a torn shade. It lands in puddles on the mossy ground, then vanishes again. This is where they came not to work, not to rest, but to remember what they weren't quite sure they'd forgotten. On the other side, a grove of fig trees, all oddly hunched, as if in the middle of whispering to one another, and unsure if you're trustworthy. You're in what the monks once called the remembering orchard. Fragments of pottery were found near the roots, along with a rusted coin stamped with an image no scholar has conclusively identified. Some say it's a lost emperor. Others insist it's a sleeping cat. It's not large. Maybe 20 trees, a few half-stone benches, and a thick layer of fallen fruit underfoot. The air smells like sweet rot and slow forgiveness. You can't name it, not quite, but you feel it behind your ribs and the way your shoulders settle without instruction. It tastes like childhood, messy, complicated, a little too sweet, but somehow just right. One fig falls nearby with a soft, resigned plop. You glance up. The tree doesn't apologize. According to old texts, the orchard was believed to trigger memory. Not with magic, exactly just with its overwhelming combination of scent, shadow, and silence. One monk wrote that sitting under the third tree from the east brought back the sound of his mother's hands kneading bread. Another claimed he remembered the shape of a lost friend's laugh. A third remembered that he forgot to turn off the cheese cellar door and said nothing about it for 30 years. One major historical note: this orchard was planted over the site of an even older garden, possibly Ramong, possibly mythical. Scholars still debate whether the orchard's memory effect was real, or simply the product of sleep-deprived monks and fermented fig juice. You find a bench shaped like a slice of melon and sit. A breeze drifts by cool, citrus sweet, and brings with it the echo of something tender. A fig lands beside you, already cracked open. You take a bite without thinking. A small placard nailed to a nearby tree reads, "Remember without sorting, not every box needs a label." You stay in the orchard longer than you expected. Time does not press. Eventually, when the shadows start folding inward like well-behaved napkins, you rise and continue on, stepping carefully between fallen fruit and fragments of your own half-remembered feelings. The path out of the orchard is marked not by signs, but by stones placed deliberately, a breadcrumb trail of intention. Each one carved with a single word: stillness, pause, wait, breathe. You obey, even if only in spirit. You walk, you drift, and the garden continues to hold its breath around you, just long enough to remind you that it still can. The path now feels more like a hallway hedges, pressed in tight on both sides, their leaves brushing your arms like a gentle crowd. Overhead, the sky has vanished behind thick canopies, giving everything a soft green tint, as if the world itself has decided to nap beneath a veil of eucalyptus. You pass under a wooden archway that groans like an old book being opened. Above it, a carved emblem of a snail wearing a crown. You've reached the kingdom of slow things. This was never meant to be part of the original garden, but somehow it always was. The monks didn't plant it. It just happened. Things grew slowly here, absurdly slowly. Vines that took years to cross a single trellis. Flowers that bloomed once a decade and immediately fell asleep again. Even the soil seemed reluctant to shift. You walk slowly, because it's all that's allowed. The air here resists haste. Your heartbeat even takes a moment to downshift. Literally, one section of the path is cordoned off for a snail processional, which happens only when the garden feels like it. You see one now gleaming, absurdly majestic, riding a large leaf carried by 3 ants. No one sits on it, but something about it feels watched. Not by a person, by the moment itself, as if time occasionally sits there to rest. No one cheers. It doesn't need applause. The kind of lag that feels like finally catching up with yourself. It continues on unbothered. You decide not to question it. One historical account scribbled on a birch bark scroll, of all things, mentions a gardener who once tried to hurry a chrysanthemum into bloom using candlelight and urgent whispering. The flower responded by not blooming for 15 years. When it finally did, it was exactly one petal short. Coincidence? Probably. Funny? Absolutely. A small sign at your feet reads, "You bow, why not, to the empty throne," and continue on at the exact pace the garden allows. Speed is for milk boiling and mosquito swatting. All else can wait. The snails here are revered. A cultural curiosity. The monks once held an annual festival of inconvenient patience. They would attempt to paint murals using only dew, or tell stories in reverse over the course of a week. The longest story ever told this way was about a lost sock that found its pair again, but only after becoming a dust rag and learning humility. Scholars still debate whether the festival was symbolic or just something they did to avoid spring cleaning. You reach the heart of the kingdom, a small stone throne surrounded by mushrooms. You take a seat on a nearby stump instead. It's surprisingly warm. You close your eyes and feel everything slow just slightly more. Even your thoughts begin to lag behind your breath. You hear a faint crunch nearby. You open one eye to see a tortoise walking past. It's wearing a tiny cloak. You blink. Eventually, you rise not out of urgency, but because your bones have finished soaking in stillness. The hedges part ahead, revealing what at first seems like a courtyard. But then you realize it's not enclosed. It just feels like it is. Because of the way the trees lean inward, the benches are just a touch too far from the path to be convenient. The flower beds are planted in irregular polygons. The fountain in the middle, if you can call it, that trickles in 3 different directions at once, like it hasn't made up its mind. And the ground is tiled with worn stones that refuse to line up with one another. You've entered what the monks once called the plaza of misaligned purposes. Here, nothing quite fits. This was a place for wandering thoughts. Not structured meditation, not mindful breathing, just mental meandering. A monk once described it as a sanctuary for when you don't know what you're doing, but you're doing it anyway. You sit on a lopsided bench. It leans, but lovingly. In front of you is a sundial that spins. Not in a mystical way, it's just loose. A helpful note carved into its base reads, "Don't ask. It doesn't know either." The compromise? A place where silence and confusion could shake hands and wander off together. The project took 7 years, mostly because no one could agree on what the benches should face. One major historical detail: the plaza was built after a heated disagreement over whether silence or confusion was more spiritually valuable. It involved beginning a task they knew they wouldn't finish writing the first sentence of a story, tying one shoe, starting a drawing with one line, and then walking away. It was said to strengthen the soul's ability to let go, which are pleasantly uneven, like being held by an armful of old books, or, at the very least, to lower expectations. In the middle of a space that never decided what it wanted to be. And somehow, that feels just right. A small footpath breaks off to the side, leading toward a narrow structure that resembles a shed, or maybe a confessional, or maybe an oversized compost bin with a window. This is the hut of unfinished sentences. This time, all 3 streams point north. Inside, the walls are covered with parchment fragments, half-written letters, ideas without conclusions, thoughts that trail off like this one. You read a few. One says, "Dear Brother Aldrich, I believe the stars speak to each other, and if we could only," another reads, "Sometimes I sit with the figs and remember how the air used to taste when no one finished them. No one needed to." A cultural tidbit. Monks here sometimes held a practice called the intention of the incomplete. Scholars still debate whether this was spiritual wisdom or just a coping mechanism for having too many meetings. You return to the plaza and lie flat on the warm stones. Above you, the sky has turned the color of lavender tea. A few stars blink lazily, not in a hurry to shine. You stay there. Eventually, the fountain changes its mind again. You stand, and the garden whispers, "This way." You walk now under a canopy of hanging lanterns unlit, unnecessary, but comforting in their presence. They sway slightly in a breeze that smells of bread and old paper. You could be anywhere, or nowhere, or finally, exactly where you're supposed to be. It's an open stretch of grass, bordered by arching trees that form a natural hallway, lined with stone markers like gentle punctuation. Each marker bears a question one carved in soft, rounded script, not to be answered, just to be kept company. This is the Hall of Rested Questions. It's not a hall in the architectural sense. The monks placed them here during evening walks, letting the questions stretch their legs overnight and lie down again by dawn. You pass a few. What would you keep doing, even if no one noticed? When did you last feel like honey? Is the moon remembering you too? These weren't riddles. They weren't theological puzzles. They were offerings. One major historical fact: the practice of resting questions came from a monk named Theobald, who, after being asked too many inquiries he couldn't answer, began writing them on stones and leaving them outside. He said he was letting the garden respond. Over time, others joined. Eventually, it became a sacred ritual. If the question changed by then, it was considered healed. One particularly popular question, "Why can't I nap like I used to?" disappeared mysteriously in 1587. It was never seen again. The trees lean just slightly in your favor. You pause by a stone that reads, "What do you miss that never actually existed?" You don't answer. You don't need to. The stone isn't waiting. A cultural oddity. During certain seasons, visitors were encouraged to adopt a question carried with them, silently, for a full day, and then return it to the stone. The pages do not turn. They ripple faintly with your breath. Scholars still debate whether the question was stolen, solved, or simply fell asleep mid-walk. You move gently along the hall, your footfalls growing quieter. Even your thoughts start speaking more slowly, unsure if they're still necessary. At the end of the hall stands a small pedestal with an open book. The left page reads, "Thank you for asking." The right page is blank. You bow not out of ceremony, but gratitude. Then turning, you begin your final walk. The final stretch of the garden is unmarked. There is no sign to welcome you, no clever plaque, no poem carved into stone. Just a path of soft earth, lined with low shrubs that sway slightly, though the air itself seems still. The ground here doesn't crunch or rustle, it hushes. It was where they came when their minds had stilled, their chores had ended, and their thoughts had finally stopped trying to impress anyone, not even themselves. Every step you take feels like closing a book without a sound. They just stand, as if holding space for you, or maybe holding you gently, in a moment that doesn't need to lead anywhere. This is known, unofficially, as the garden's exhale. The monks never gave it a name, because they believed some places deserved to simply be. The trees grow taller here, not in grandeur, but in patience. They don't seem to lean or twist. A bench waits beneath one of them, carved from a single piece of wood, worn smooth by centuries of leaning backs and tired elbows. When asked what he'd heard, he answered, "Nothing. But it was the kindest nothing I've ever known." You sit without thinking. You exhale without realizing. It wraps around your ankles, curls into your collar, tucks itself gently behind your ears. Stars blink through like slow thoughts rising from deep rest. One final historical note. This bench, according to Warren records, was once called the listening seat. A monk who built it claimed the wood could hear the part of you that doesn't to speak. Over time, visitors left small offerings beneath it, pebbles, feathers, broken buttons, the occasional dried flower. Not out of ritual, just because. You glance beneath your seat. A single acorn sits there now. Not fresh, not old, just there. A quiet cultural footnote. One monk, Brother Emmerich, once spent 12 straight nights here, never sleeping, never writing, just listening. Scholars still debate whether he was being profound or simply very, very sleep-deprived. You lean back. The bench does not complain. Above you, the branches lace together, cradling pockets of sky in their arms. And then, without announcement, a sound. Wind. Not sharp or stirring, just present. The kind of wind that doesn't push, but invites. You realize you've reached the end of the path, and somehow also the middle of something. You close your eyes, not to block out the world, but to let it in more softly. And now, let yourself slow even further. You are still seated on the listening bench, though perhaps your body has wandered on. Perhaps it's already curled beneath warm sheets, or gently drifting somewhere between thought and dream. Either way, the garden remains. It stretches around you, not like a map, but like a memory. Not with force, but the way moss settles over stone. Effortless, inevitable. Even the breeze has begun to soften its edges, brushing past with the gentleness of turning a page in a book you've already read a dozen times. Quiet, warm, a little overgrown in all the best places. Breathe in. All of it now dissolving into the same fabric of slowness, folded and tucked between one moment and the next. Let your shoulders melt downward. The stars above you blink more slowly now. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimes once not to summon, not to remind, just to say, you're still here. You remember, faintly, the taste of the fig, the scent of time beneath your shoe, the feel of the parchment questions beneath your fingertips. You are inside a place that does not count hours. And the garden? It's not ending. It's simply letting go of your hand, with the trust that you know the way out or the way deeper in. You do not need to move. Not now. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Stillness stretches out in all directions. Let yourself rest here in the Garden of Clockless Hours. Sleep if sleep comes, and if not, be soothed by the quiet companionship of stillness. Good night, traveler. You've walked well.